Hi class, in this recording we will be focusing on how we protect our stomach and regulate secretions within our stomach. As we look at our stomach, it's important that we protect it because our stomach is constantly being exposed to a highly acidic environment with lots of digestive enzymes. In other words, the stomach is going to be constantly trying to digest itself. So there's this tug of war. The stomach wants to do a really good job of digesting tissues, but the problem is the better the stomach does, the better job it does at digesting tissues, the better it is at digesting itself. So there needs to be a happy medium. And to help with that happy medium, we have a mucus coat. And this mucus within the stomach is unique in that it's extra thick mucus and it's highly alkaline mucus, not music. What was I thinking there? And this highly alkaline mucus is going to help neutralize the stomach acid so it can resist the action of the stomach acid, and any digestive enzymes which need that acidic environment will be partially neutralized by that alkaline mucus. In between the epithelial cells of the stomach wall, we also have tight junctions, and those are those watertight barriers that keep liquids from going in between cells. And this will keep all of the stomach juice or gastric juice, this acidic digestive cocktail of enzymes, from getting out of the stomach to digest deeper tissues within the body. We also have a lot of cell replacement. The cells within our stomach that line the stomach have a very short lifespan. They only live 3 to 6 days. We're constantly sloughing them off and replacing them and regrowing the cells within our stomach. These cells are going to be regrown using the gastric pits as a source of origin, or an origin source. So we have replacement cells constantly migrating out of the gastric pit to repopulate the lining of the stomach. If these measures within our stomach break down, which can happen occasionally, this will typically result in some inflammation, and if that inflammation progresses, we could have the stomach digest a small hole in itself, which is known as a peptic ulcer, and those can be quite painful. Now, as we look at the regulation of the stomach, or the gastric system, the gastric organ, we have both nervous regulation and endocrine regulation. They work together. We find that when we upregulate the stomach, we have an increase in gastric secretion. So when we eat food, this helps to activate the digestive system, and we'll have more secretions within the stomach, and we'll have the stomach moving more so it can move chyme through it quicker into the first part of the small intestine, the duodenum. And then as the stomach empties, gastric secretions go down and motility goes down, and your sense of hunger increases correspondingly. Now, when we look at this process of regulating the stomach, it's broken up, this activity of the stomach is broken up into 3 phases: the cephalic, the gastric, and the intestinal phase. Cephalic is a word that refers to the brain, so the stomach is being controlled by the brain during the cephalic phase. The gastric phase is, gastric meaning stomach, is when the stomach controls the stomach or controls itself. And then the intestinal phase is when the small intestine releases signals that affect the stomach. All of these phases, gastric, cephalic, and intestinal phases, aren't discrete phases. They overlap with each other, and they can even occur all at the same time, all simultaneously with each other. So let's dive into it. As we look at the cephalic phase, this is when we think about the food. So we look at it, we smell it, we just daydream about how delicious an ice cream sundae would be. We're having either the smells or our imagination sending input signals to the hypothalamus of our brain. And as that hypothalamus receives those signals, it will relay the signals to the medulla oblongata of the brainstem, where we have the vagus nerve exiting. And that vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10, will exit from the medulla oblongata and go all the way down to the stomach, where it interfaces with the enteric nervous system and stimulates gastric secretions. So in other words, just thinking about food, just smelling food, is going to cause your stomach to have more gastric secretions. It's getting ready to eat. So thinking about food gets your stomach ready to digest food. Next, we have the gastric phase. And this gastric phase is going to be the phase when we're swallowing food and we have that semi-digested food just hanging out in the stomach. And as we have the semi-digested food, this partially digested chyme hanging out in the stomach, it causes the stomach to become distended, to stretch out. And as that stomach stretches out, it is going to activate stretch receptors. Something else that happens is as we add food to the stomach, so as the bolus and the beverages enter into the stomach, we dilute the stomach acid and cause the stomach's contents to become less acidic and more alkaline. We move the overall pH of the stomach towards the neutral end of the spectrum. And as the pH moves towards neutral, that's also going to stimulate gastric activity. So as we look at this process, there will be three chemicals associated with gastric phase. We have acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is going to be secreted by parasympathetic nerve fibers, and that acetylcholine will be associated with the myenteric reflexes, the stretch reflex. So as we stretch out the stomach, that'll trigger the release of the acetylcholine. As we look at histamine, histamine will be a paracrine secretion. So we find that those G cells, or those enteroendocrine cells in the bottom of the gastric pits, release histamine, and that histamine goes from the stomach and turns around and goes back to the stomach. It's a paracrine secretion, so it's a tissue affecting itself, or an organ affecting itself. And that histamine will then go back to the stomach and help upregulate gastric secretions. And then we also have gastrin. Gastrin is a potent hormone released by the G cells within the pyloric glands from down here in the pyloric region, and that gastrin will also travel back to the stomach and upregulate gastric juice secretion. So we can have the stomach better able to digest the food that's within it. As we look at the intestinal phase, this intestinal phase is when food is leaving the stomach and goes into the duodenum, the very first part of the small intestine. And as that duodenum of the small intestine receives chyme from the stomach, it needs to moderate the input of chyme from the stomach. It doesn't want too much, it doesn't want too little. It wants to get just the right flow of juice from the stomach. So it will regulate gastric activity using hormones and nervous system input. And as we look at the duodenum, initially it enhances, it upregulates gastric secretion because the duodenum, generally speaking, when we start eating a meal, the first part of our small intestine is usually pretty empty and it wants to, hey, get busy. So as the duodenum starts to stretch out, as it receives just a little bit of stretching or chyme from the stomach, it's going to send a signal back to the stomach to stimulate more activity within the stomach. So a mild stretching of the duodenum causes the stomach to become more active. And then as peptides and amino acids and chyme gather at the enteroendocrine cells, the G cells of the duodenum, that's going to cause them to secrete more gastrin, and that gastrin will travel back to the stomach, causing the stomach to have more upregulation. However, there's something that slows the duodenum down, and that's acid and fat. Now, whenever we have something draining from the stomach into the duodenum, we're going to have hydrochloric acid going into the duodenum. So the moment we start digesting food in the small intestine, we first upregulate gastric activity, but very quickly or soon, we start to downregulate stomach activity or gastric activity. But here's a key thing here. Fat slows down or downregulates stomach activity or gastric activity. It is going to inhibit the stomach. And this is a key idea here behind feeling full longer. When somebody does not have any fat in their meal, that food tends to move through their stomach quicker. But if they have some fat or lipids in their meals, that lipid, as it's entering the duodenum, will slow down the entry of food into the duodenum, causing food to remain in the stomach longer, which means that people who have some fat with their meals tend to feel full for a longer period of time. As we look at the duodenum, it's also going to send a signal to the medulla oblongata that inhibits the vagal nerve and is going to stimulate the sympathetic neurons. So as the duodenum stretches out, it's going to inhibit the activity of the stomach after prolonged stretching, and it does that by downregulating the parasympathetic nervous system and upregulating the sympathetic nervous system. And there's a happy balance here at play. As we look at our intestinal phase, that chyme that enters into the stomach or enters into the duodenum. So down here is the chyme from the stomach goes into the duodenum. It's also going to cause the G cells or the enteroendocrine cells of the duodenum to release some more hormones, particularly secretin and CCK, known as cholecytokinin. And the secretin and CCK are going to travel to our pancreas and gallbladder to upregulate secretions from those two accessory organs, and the secretin and CCK travel to the stomach to downregulate gastric secretions in the stomach. As we look at the gastrin that's released, declines over time, and eventually the pyloric sphincter will start to contract to limit the amount of chyme that enters into the duodenum. So as gastrin goes into the stomach, it can cause constriction of this pyloric sphincter and make it so that the duodenum has more time to work and chemically digest the chyme that's entering into it from the stomach. So that's all we have for this recording on the stomach and its regulation. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to let me know or post them in the class discussion boards. And as always, happy studies.